We can take a seat and start this second lecture. We are very glad to have Francesco Strazzari, Professor of International Relations at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Pisa, who, as you have seen, has been playing an important role in putting together this summer school. And the picture he will be painting on the war system, including disarmament and international relations, will be the complementary picture to the discussion that we already had this morning. Again, his talk will be followed by a discussant. Then we will have a short break at 4, and at 4:30 we start again with the Russia-Ukraine war session. Francesco, you have the floor.
Okay. I hope you had a good lunch, and it's quite warm here. We organize summer universities in October, knowing that it's going to be warm. My role now is just to look at the other side of the coin that Mario has presented. He looked into the critical connections regarding the international political economy and the world system theory. I'll somehow build from there and look at some sub-aspects more with the political science and international relations IR perspective. Is not okay. So I'll try by looking at the way the international system is evolving, and some of what I'm going to say is almost common knowledge. I mean, there's a lot of emphasis in public debates about the fact that we are going through a period of intensifying confrontations between. This is going alone. I don't know how the system is showing going through a period of crisis and uncertainty. In terms of growing rivalry among big great powers or aspiring powers, and the way in which regimes that were somehow underpinning the previous order system, meaning among others arms control, which was so important in the mature phase of the Cold War and in its dissolution, and how at the same time traditional diplomacy seems to be dull in many of the conflict scenarios that we see. We were used to profiles of mediators that were very much low profile, performing relentless yet discreet confidential work behind the scenes. Now we see mediators starting from the White House claiming that they solved 7 wars, trying to take center stage, very much bragging about their activities, very much into the media every second day. And at the same time, the effectiveness of all that is very much in doubt. We don't see any wars going better, including those that are somehow residual in terms of being present already in the old system. Most importantly, while years ago there was a debate about whether major armed conflict was obsolete, is big wars something of the past, we see a resurgence of that. We see how important certain armed conflicts that escalate to the medium-high level are in defining the key characteristics of the system today. Of course, one cannot avoid the war in Ukraine, what's going on in Gaza and in the West Bank, and around that conflict in the wider Middle East, from Iran to what's going on in Iraq and Lebanon, but also the growing tensions in the Indo-Pacific and notably in the South Chinese Sea and in Taiwan. At the same time, armed conflicts that we can categorize as civil wars, intrastate, go on. This is somehow can be seen as a legacy of something that already was a matter of concern, some of them reaching a significant level of escalation. Thinking about the Sudan or Myanmar, these are wars that are far worse in terms of humanitarian consequences and implications than it is than one can certainly infer from the little space they gain in terms of making headlines. All of that goes with a situation where the defense industry, which is part of our focus here, is growing in a number of ways. Conflicts are escalating, number of fatalities is growing, more weapons are being tested. We see an impressive number of new weapon systems and innovation regarding the defense sector in different ways becoming relevant for our understanding of armed conflict. And we see that what was a couple of decades ago called the peace dividend, the fact that there was something to be invested from saving money through a more peaceful world, based on the liberal peace in institutions, international organization, norms, diffusion, and so on. All of that is shifting towards a priority that we see in many national and international agendas that veers towards rearming. Global spending, as a consequence, is growing. If we compare year on year 2024 with 2023, we see this is some of the readings that I sent you from CIPRI or from the International Strategic Studies Institute in London, a plus 7.4% in 1 year as an aggregate figure. That doesn't tell us much about dynamics, but it gives us a sense and the magnitude of the phenomenon. If you are a bit familiar with political science and IR and conflict studies, you also know that wars that intensify, that escalate vertically in terms of intensity, and they tend to linger over time, to become longer. They also tend almost unavoidably to expand horizontally. So they tend to get other actors involved geographically, starting with neighbors. And this is something we see very clearly today in Ukraine or in the Middle East. All of that is somehow underpinning these dynamics. How do we read all of this? I mean, do we have a scheme for reading those dynamics that is somehow consistent? Of course, we discussed US hegemony being challenged and the need for understanding hegemony as a multidimensional concept, from material to ideational aspect regarding consent and legitimacy. We see in a number of ways a crisis of the hegemon, certainly in terms of consent, not only internationally, but also domestically. We see that certain rules are no longer to be taken for granted, to say the least. And we do see indications or, indication of the fact that in a number of ways, the world we live in is more multipolar. That doesn't mean multipolarism as a doctrine applies or explains anything. It means that new actors appear to be more significant in terms of agenda setting, in terms of the outcome of dynamics. Does that mean we are going through a transition? If so, to what? Do we see a new form of new poles emerging? Of course, if we look at international political economy, we see how supplying lines, value chains are changing. We see the entire logistical the creation of new hubs through friends and no longer through the idea of endlessly interchangeable supply lines. We have an idea that there are commercial blocks that are emerging and they are determined by political factors. But let's not rush that in too much. Let's look at some aspects that I think might be useful, and let's look at that through a lens of international security. Now, a couple of things about what we remember the international liberal order, or as it became called more recently, rules-based order, eclipsing a bit that liberal, which was very much en vogue back when the G7 was created, with the contribution of some colleagues, some political scientists like John Ickenberg, and those who were very much behind the idea of global governance through informal venues and so on. We remember how the past 70 years were based on an idea of global institutions, process, habits, and rules that would tend towards establishing security communities as broad areas where war became unthinkable. War was called defense pretty much everywhere, and we see that being reversed today. We have a Secretary of War in the United States convening all the generals for an agenda which is not disclosed, that will be discussed tomorrow, unpredictably. Even institutionally speaking, we don't know what's going on. We don't have a name for what is happening. We see principles that were very much inspiring that system: free trade, open markets. At the same time, we see protection and protectionism becoming the new creed at the center. And we see an attempt that was made of transforming authoritarian countries, especially those that led to World War I, and through democratization, with the famous 4 waves of democratization Samuel Huntington identifies, the last one after the end of the Cold War, and the idea that democracy had become a kind of default game in town. All of this is being reversed. Political scientists talk about 17 years in a row of democratic backsliding. We can discuss whether that's actually happening, what we define as democracy, but definitely something is going on whereby we can no longer consider democracy to be expanding like socialism or like the universe. At the same time, neoliberalism as the crisis of state and society in the South and the defeat of the Soviet bloc in the East are no longer terms of reference for understanding what is going on in terms of the relationship between the state and the economy and society. 70 years on, we can talk about the crisis of the system. We can talk about multilateralism no longer having the effect it used to be, humanitarian intervention, peace building, all of those notions, many of us were formed on those notions, are becoming problematic even in designing our syllabi in teaching at universities. We need to make room for something new, for decoding and deciphering the present. We can talk about constitutive traumas of a system. We can talk about the 2001 terror attacks in the United States, the war on terror. We can talk about the financial crisis of 2007-8, the first one to be located at the core of the center. We can talk about the COVID pandemic, with the world undergoing a slump of 25% in a couple of weeks. We can talk about the invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of 2022. We can talk about how the genocidal drifting of war in Gaza has basically detonated all principles. We no longer talk even about double standard. We talk about no standard at all. We can discuss what are the responsibility of the West in promoting those inconsistent responses. We can talk about the role that some revisionist powers, starting with Russia and China, have in challenging the system, whether they want to revise the system or to destroy the system. Definitely, they are placed in a different way. China benefited very much from neoliberal globalization. Russia did not. Russia is a carrier of a different sort of revisionism, much more on the military side, and that also creates a certain asymmetry among the two. Not to talk about India, if you want to consider some other potential protagonist. In this picture, you see how the world is projected in terms of between now and 2050. These are World Bank data. If you look at in terms of GDP, the first 7 countries, you see that among them, there's only the United States will remain part of the G7. The others are China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Russia. You can add Mexico before you see Japan and Germany. Italy is number 12. So this different distribution in terms of GDP and resources, how is that reflected in global ranking, in ordering? We see summits of the Global South intensifying over the past few years. We mentioned today the BRICS, but BRICS is not the only forum. There are regional organizations, the Shanghai Organization and others. We see certain countries that were considered, solid allies of the West. Think about India resisting very much aligning with the West on Ukraine, resisting the adoption of sanctions, and eventually even coming to terms with its own division vis-à-vis China, trying to not realignment, but at least reconciliation with China. So there's a form of global multipolarity which keeps taking shape as we speak. How is that translated in terms of security dynamics? Here we see a geo-referenced map of armed violence in the world. This is CIPRI data. And below you see, in a very arbitrary distinction between high-level and low-level armed conflicts, where the blue part of the graph is low-level, general armed conflict, meaning at least 25 fatalities in events that are war-related battles and so on, whereas the red line is actually what is major armed conflict. You don't capture in that map very much of a growth of war in terms of the portion vis-a-vis armed conflict more in general. Yes, there is an increase starting with 2021. The line is going up over there. But if you look at that in terms of decades, it's not particularly sensitive. But you do see in general a growth. If you put together a line through the peaks and the lows, you see that there's a soar in the amount of violence, somehow more decentralized, maybe, depending on the type of violence. You would have to factor in organized crime, drug wars in Mexico, Brazil, and so on. It's difficult to make sense of those figures. We should probably need a class on that specifically, but in general, the image is not as clear as sometimes we claim it to be. Be that as it may, going back to the figures of global military spending, the United States is now projected to trillions. China is growing. Russia went up by 41% year over year last year. And in terms of global GDP, we moved over the past couple of years from 1.6 to almost 2% of global GDP. So aggregate figures still suggest, in spite of that picture, there's a significant component of military spending that keeps going up. US versus China versus Russia, in terms of today's picture, the military balance by the IISS. The US still accounts for more than a third of global military spending. That has an impact on any definition of hegemony, at least in terms of military preponderance, materially speaking. You do see other countries growing, and some of them, take India, for example, projected to grow very fast. Very fast. Others, like Germany, are becoming important players, overcoming Saudi Arabia, also in terms of GDP per capita. At the same time, we see a decline, some would say an erosion, some would say a fragmentation of traditional armed control regimes that are inherited from the architecture that was sealed by the end of the Cold War. Now, we could take different lines into that. Here you have a timeline. This is a bit too recent. You should probably start from the moment the United States abandoned the ABM treaty, the treaty on anti-ballistic missiles. That was after 9/11. The idea was that, the type of threats was changing, and that treaty was obsolete, but that was very much resented by Russia and very much prompted by the US Republicans in Senate, by basically saying that there was a need for a shield against the Iranian missiles, and that was to be made in Poland. That was very much angering Russia at that point. But then if you go on, you see a number of events that call into question that structure. The last one is the faltering of the comprehensive ban on nuclear arms, including the question that it was never ratified into a treaty, as you probably know, but still, it remained implicit in terms of non-nuclear experiments and so on. But at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, Russia declared it to be suspended and to keep itself not bound by any provision in that. But more than this, the START treaty, which took the shape of a new START, putting a ceiling on strategic nuclear weapons, is in a moment of, at the fulcrum, meaning that it expires early next year, in February 2026. Last week, Putin, among other things, while reiterating a number of threats about Russian jets that could be downed by NATO forces, he mentioned inter alia that he would propose a renewal of the START treaty for a year if the US complies with that. We don't know exactly how this is evolving. Maybe some of you has some hints to that, but what is important is that in general, we see that the level of trust and the level of compliance have been eroded in the past few years for a number of reasons that are technical, new technologies, a generalized modernization of arsenals, which have made, for example, double use problematic in terms of detection of the type of threat, in terms of response mechanism, vectors that can either carry nuke or non-nuclear explosives, but that can reach Mach 12 beyond becoming hypersonic and leaving less and less time for identifying the threat and providing an answer to that, a response to that. You do see complex dynamics in terms of the nuclear triad, land-based, submarine-based launchers, and airborne nuke. We do see problems regarding conventional forces as well. Those treaties, like the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe, that were deposited in Vienna with the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, are no longer a cornerstone of the system. A declining transparency, plenty of suspicion, and most importantly, a multiplication of actors, which makes rational calculus more and more problematic. China is expanding its capacity. We can discuss how much, whether it's true that they're reaching 300 new silos or new bases or not. There are reasons to think that this has been, instrumentally amplified for justifying soaring military budget. The same goes with an assessment of Russian capacities and new weapons. Russia, at the same time, has an interest in showing that they have that it has more powerful weapons and more lethal weapons than anyone can stop or prevent from striking. Yet, it is a fact that what we see in terms of what is being showcased in conflict areas or experimented gives us an indication that the game has become more complex in terms of understanding which warheads and where. Also in terms, not only strategic, but because great powers have laid more emphasis, and the Trump administration, already with Trump 1, was very clear about that, was not the first one, but definitely put more emphasis on that, towards flexible responses. The idea that we can go from here to there and use nuclear weapons, for example, also in regional scenarios. To add more complexity, we do see in the past few years the emergence of space forces, the militarization of space. For those of you who have any background in terms of international law, you know that the law of space was very much crafted at a time in which there was an idea that the space was a dimension of exploration, collaboration, common good. This is no longer the case because of the prevalence of private actors. Think about Elon Musk, but not only, connecting strategic resources, lithium with satellites, with your cell phone in terms of disintermediated news. The number of satellites is a problem in terms of space debris, possible incidents, waterfall effects that this might have, also because satellites are important for early warning systems, also including thermonuclear war. If something goes wrong there will be implications for civil infrastructure and for military infrastructure. And the experimenting of counter-satellite technology, whereby each power has destroyed its own satellites, nevertheless giving a clear warning to the others, we have the technology to take down a satellite, is another worrisome development. We have 4 nations that have reached the moon. They have projected to build moon bases. I come from a university where we study communication with the moon. I mean, you don't pick up the phone and call the moon. You need a certain type of laser beam, and you need a certain type of technology to build a base there. You cannot go with bricks to the moon. You need to have 3D printers to use the moon soil to build. So there's a lot of technological aspects that are triggering sea change in this domain, introducing more and more uncertainty. If we look at the data are quite clear. A large portion of this development has to do with military dimension and with the weapons component and related systems, including command and control, a number of startups that have developed new systems for command and control using artificial intelligence for new solutions in that, for target acquisition. We have seen part of that in the genocide in Gaza. We have seen the use of AI for target selection. We have seen an increase tenfold in terms of number of people killed per individual strike if we compare that with the bombing in Raqqa, for example. It was the previous bombing campaign. Few words on Europe. I'm sure there will be more occasions to talk about that. With this Bilan Shamushi, we have produced a report on that, on how Europe is rearming. That has very much to do with political problems, with the fact that, especially with the election of Donald Trump to the White House, Europe felt totally disoriented in terms of how solid is Article 5, the transatlantic community, protection guarantees, the mechanisms that govern a politico-military alliance, not just an alliance, but a politico-military alliance based on norms, et cetera, et cetera. And we see at the same time Donald Trump being able to push Europeans to commit 5% of their GDP in terms of military spending. This is something we could discuss forever. What are the implications? It's totally unprecedented, not so much in terms of numbers, but because during the Cold War, we reached levels like that in some countries, not all, yet in absence of a priority in terms of fighting climate change, mitigating climate change, and in a totally different situation of social contract with different relations between trade unions and social spending, and with the population in the West being much younger. So that puts a lot of stress on Europe, and Europe is answering in terms of spending more on the military with new industrial defense industry deals that are run basically by the Commission, by Ursula von der Leyen, who's reconfiguring also the relationship between the political level and the corporate level. The type of consultation and what are the main lines of development are very much built in a situation where the Parliament is not, the European Parliament doesn't have an oversight role because everything goes under emergency. Everything goes under the idea of an impending threat. New ammunition, new plants, all of that is where Germany, by having the fiscal space for doing that, is leading, and other countries are somehow trying to follow. In overall terms, over the past 12 years, we see that the European NATO defense spending has been growing quite along the steep line in real terms. But the model is changing. We call them militarization trends. In real terms, we estimate that as a plus 66% compared to 2013. And here you have some figures about what rearm Europe means in numbers, or what is also called readiness or preparedness. I mean, the name has been changing. Also, the fact that much of that goes under national budgets, with the European Union providing the stimulus, the impetus, but then in a situation where in Europe, in most countries in Europe, the nationalist far-right forces are either in control of cabinet, like in Italy, or able to affect the coalition that runs countries, like in Germany or in France. We don't know how that will go, but definitely we're in a different situation compared to 12 years ago, politically speaking. So growing military budgets and nationalist forces able to have an impact on cabinets. The same probably goes for the UK. In terms of industrial innovation, I just stress the fact that things are happening in terms of 3D printing, automation, robotics, new startups that are able to work with the Department of Defense, now Department of War in the United States, major protagonism on the part of Rheinmetall or the Italian Leonardo in terms of ammunition and artillery shells, all driven by the Ukraine conflict and the growing demand, internationally speaking. Warfare is changing. I don't have to spend time on that. I just mentioned some of these things in terms of logistics, the return of mass as a defining feature in war, big numbers, optical fibers, AI, camouflage deception. Things are constantly adapting and changing. Why is that problematic in terms of IR? Because we have seen armed races and we know what the security dilemma is. We see that what is claimed to be done in the name of defense turned out to be perceived as an offensive weapon. We see how the expanding of military spending in China and in Russia is read unequivocally as an offensive potential, and how that can spiral up into a mistake or escalatory dynamics that absorb resources that would normally be devoted to aging populations or development aid or health or anything else. And we see the extent to which over the past 20 years, a pervasive realist culture, geopolitics has been adopted in the public debate, especially in Europe, as the one paradigm for understanding what is a priority in terms of policy. And how difficult it is to create a counter narrative to that. Say, like, why do you read deterministically things that way? How can you accept the social production of that, the social construction of something as a threat, and not cast that in terms of a problematic issue to be dealt with in terms of common security and so on and so forth? You see the importance that a certain culture has in framing narrative. We see how data can be manipulated. I mean, incidentally, today I was just reading, coming here, the reading that Axios, one of the big press, agencies that are very important in determining the titles in the newspapers, has on data on terror in the United States. How everything is framed in terms of the rise of left-wing terrorism in the United States, and all data show the opposite. The data of the study they quote show the opposite, and yet the way they are read and interpreted and the way the graphs are built give the impression that there is a 30-year high in left-wing terrorism, even in presence of solid data. How easy it is to manipulate that to serve a political purpose. Nuclear forces are part of the problem. Some data here. We see the way in which Russia is trying to reduce every problem to a bilateral issue. The Alaska summit was very much part of that theater. We don't have a Ukraine problem. We don't have a Taiwan problem. We don't have a Chinese problem. We have a problem in Washington, Moscow. Let's fix that, and everything will follow through a return to bipolar thinking. And we see how new systems are being adopted in the US, the Sentinel ICBM in terms of ground, Columbia in terms of submarines, new generation, and the P-21 bomber coming into use. Russia showing every day a new type of, devastating new weapon. China being projected to expand its own bases. New type of missiles, new type of dual capability system, and new type of independently targetable re-entry vehicles. New doctrines. Russia has been lowering the threshold, even if, to what extent doctrines are important, or they're just a matter of messaging. We can discuss that in the case of Russia. We see new nuclear bombs deployed in Europe by the US. We see debates about to what extent the nuclear umbrella should be extended to new NATO partners, to what extent the French should be using their force de frappe to cover other allies, etc. We see regional deterrence being redefined in its global significance, in other terms. And we see ambiguity. Israel, North Korea, India and Pakistan that actually had clashes this year. All of that speaks to new tensions and the way the global system is changing. To conclude, let me give you some trends. We see a return of a discussion of nuclear weapons due to the pretty much universal trend of modernization. We see deterrence becoming multipolar, with at least Russia, China, India, plus regional actors playing a role. We see a different entanglement where question of dual-use systems increase the risk of escalation. The proliferation of new weapon systems, hypersonics, drone swarms, maybe led by AI, so automation, killer robots, and so on. Electronic warfare, scrambling systems, hybrid forms of deniability, etc. They undermine traditional deterrence. The way the Ukrainians have been hitting strategic bombers in Russia has undermined strategic deterrence, because those bombers were kept in full sight to show, compliance with treaties. We see space-based systems expanding the battlefield beyond borders, making escalation more harder to contain. And we see deterrence no longer a matter of US-Russia, but also expanded to other actors. Regional wars may have global nuclear spillovers. Scenarios. Military balances will increasingly shape diplomacy, trade, and alliances, especially in Eastern Europe and in the Indo-Pacific. This seems to be something where I see some consent in literature. And rising defense budgets will make hard power resurfacing as the main currency in IR. This is at least the descriptive element that you find as mainstream today. This is what traditional military thinking tends to portray as tomorrow's scenario. US hegemony transforming, growing multipolarity with things that we cannot take for granted because, yes, it's true. We see Hollywood, but also Nollywood and Bollywood. Still, they're called wood. Still, there are ways of aping the United States, even the Islamic State. At some point in their recruitment, they were somehow simulating the idea of good life with Luna Park, with Italian ice cream. So is it really counter-hegemonic? There are aspects that are quite transnational, if not universal, we can say. We see the military-industrial complex consolidating its power, and that means more lobbying and capacity to shape policy, and there's a problem for democracy there. We see strategic resources competition making rivalries and trade disputes stiffer and harder. And we see less and less multilateral crisis management and more ad hoc crisis management. Imperial peace, you can call it. How do we rethink peace? Do we think that the liberal peace can be restored? Does it give us element of reference to which we should look for with some nostalgia? Or should we think beyond that? How should we think deterrence from a different point of view? How should we think about arms control the moment they are weakening? Should we just look at the good old days as something that is desirable, or should we try to throw some weight beyond and into the future? I stop here. Thank you.